Hi there. So today I wanted to talk about something that I've noticed from a lot of sort of potential students, people who study jazz, people who are frustrated with trying to learn the music, and as well as a lot of people who are kind of sniffing around and sort of interested in maybe looking into having, for instance, jazz guitar lessons, as well as my own personal experiences. And this is, why are we so afraid to trust our musical judgment? And I say we because this is how I used to feel, maybe 10, 15 years ago as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, for instance, like there's this, and I've spoken to a lot of players, even like very good ones, and there's generally a sort of sense that, there's a sort of code of rules of how to do music, like this music properly, and then if you don't do this in some way, you're not doing the right thing. So, for instance, the obvious touchstone would be chord scale theory. Not because I think chord scale theory is inherently a bad thing at all. In fact, I rather like it, but rather because I think it's been so easily turned into a product, an educational technology, if you like, that you can sell to people, and it's become extremely successful in that way. So, for instance, if you're on the internet and you type in jazz improvisation, the chances are you're going to run something that has reference to chord scale theory very quickly. So people sort of see, for instance, using the right scale over the right chord, or all of this stuff. And of course, actually, the joke is that if you go back into the history of jazz and actually transcribe everybody, you'll notice that half of the time they're not observing these rules at all. I mean, one example, and this is obviously from much older music, but I was looking at Lester Young's solo on Lady Be Good, which is one of the sort of all-time study jazz solos. I think at one point everybody learned that solo. And if you look at it, you'll notice that, like in the second bar, the song's chords are G major, C7, it goes C7 in the second bar, and Lester Young blatantly plays a B over it. So, I mean, they weren't interested in the rules in that way, and perhaps even if you look at players like Charlie Parker, where they're playing one chord on top of another, or you see examples of people playing perhaps an F sharp on a G7 chord and so on and so forth, or, in the case of Red Garland, maybe he's playing voicings that actually clash between the hands, people didn't really care about that stuff. So it's kind of become much more recently that people have started to worry about these things, and I think it would be really helpful if we told students that from time to time. I think, as I say, this is the history of jazz education. It's not even the colleges necessarily, because I think the colleges are, despite the needs of academia to come out with things like syllabuses and stuff, which I would question with respect to jazz. I think jazz really resist pedagogy. Actually, I think any creative endeavor does. But teachers who play music understand this stuff, right? They've transcribed everybody. They play gigs. They understand the limitations of any syllabus, any set of rules. And yet somehow this has become a thing in its own right, that kind of people think about jazz. And like you'll get rock guitarists who approach you and say, "I want to learn jazz," and you go, "Great, okay, cool. Who you listen to?" And they don't listen to any jazz musicians. They just want to play jazz because it's a thing that some of the more advanced rock players do, like I don't know, Guthrie Govan or Martin Miller or whoever. And it's like, well, that's not jazz. That's if you want to learn Martin Miller, let's just transcribe Martin Miller. I don't, it's not. Jazz is a form of music. On the other hand, even more egregiously, they might think that jazz is a series of scales, or or fancy chords or something, and it's not. It really isn't. And this is down to the reduction, I think, of jazz to being a set of musical technologies. And I'm not going to do a full-on sort of critical theory type sort of attack on jazz education in that way. I've certainly read some academic papers that do make that point very well. It's interesting, in a way that we write down jazz solos, and jazz like solos have the ones that people play become more about pitch and rhythm choice and less about things like timbre or phrasing, or subtleties of intonation, as perhaps they were 100 years ago. Well, that stuff's really interesting about the commodify, like the measurement and sort of quantification of jazz and the way that thing can then be sold. We can talk about that in a separate video. But the upshot of this is that people, I think, are ashamed of their musical judgment, or they're not willing to trust it. And I think this is a real shame. For instance, the first time I discovered that I could just basically play in B flat over rhythm changes, this happened about 15 years ago, it was like a weight had lifted off my shoulders, and suddenly I was able to play rhythm changes well. People used to come up to me and say that I played it well. So obviously it worked. And that change in my playing was brought about by throwing out knowledge, information, systems, rules, and I've heard other people play the same. Other people say the same thing. I've even heard people who've come out of music college saying that they have no idea how to play rhythm changes, and I find that extraordinary. You know, they've been on jazz courses, they're very good players, you know, but they say this, and I think that is a failure of our education system to present things like rhythm changes and the blues as an opportunity for creativity, rather than simply something which has to be mastered according to some kind of rule set, whether that's the chord scale theory or bebop vocabulary or whatever it is. So in any case, traditional jazz learning, and I say learning rather than pedagogy, because pedagogy in jazz is not really that traditional. You can think of people like Barry Harris and Lenny Tristano, but really Lenny Tristano would, I think, agree with what I'm saying, which is that you listen to lots and lots of jazz and you learn it. You learn it by heart, and you learn to sing the solos and all the rest of it. And you know, even someone like Rick Beato, for instance, you know, made a video making a very similar point to the point I'm making. I'm just going a little bit further and saying this has actually altered the way we think about jazz, and it's damaging our ability to play jazz. So what I suggest, you know, just put something on, put on a rhythm changes in B flat or a blues, whatever you like, and just make up melodies. Okay, I have a few videos of me doing that sort of thing. There's a diatonic video, there's a playing blues on changes video. It's such an important thing, but trust your ears. Listen to the players you like, imitate phrases by them, try and play phrases in the same sort of vein, and imagine what you're going to play in your mind's ear before you play it. It's like the reverse of transcription, right? Transcription trains that muscle by exposing you to music, and you have to play it by ear, and you get better and better at doing that. Okay. So I just wanted to ground this in something that's actually got something to do with music. I'll give you a quick practical example. And I was going to say, we're going to take the example of Kenny Wheeler. And Kenny Wheeler is known as a kind of modern, non-functional jazz composer, highly influential, especially I think here in the UK. He was British Canadian. And there's a brilliant record that I'm taking a song from, which is called Kind Folk, and it's from the album Angel Song, which is a wonderful record with the now very sadly late Lee Konitz on saxophone, Kenny Wheeler playing trumpet and flugel, and then on the guitar, wonderful Mr. Bill Frisell, and Dave Holland on bass. Check it out, please, if you haven't heard it, it's great. And the song is called Kind Folk, and Kind Folk is this beautiful tune. The changes are not functional at all, so it kind of goes from G major to B minor, like rocking backwards and forwards like this. Okay, and then we get this movement to F major sharp 11th, very pungent chord in this context. F sharp half diminished. C major 7th with a G in the bass, and we get this kind of A flat 7 chord going into D flat minor, and then A major, and then it goes down the note like this, right? The G sharp minus 11th and F sharp minor 11th chords. So the overall structure of it is, you know, quite all over the place, right? So if it's thinking about the chords, we go from G major, or G Lydian actually, really. The melody, I think, is the melody. Yeah, it's kind of G Lydian oriented. Well, it kind of sits over the B minor, so it has more of a Aeolian or natural minor quality. Okay, so that's how the melody works over it, and actually the melody really belongs mostly to that G Lydian stroke G major tonality. So even when we get these chords, there's E and B, both which belong to G major, and then we get it walks down a scale using a C natural this time, so G Ionian if you like, and then B A. So there's nothing there which doesn't belong to G major, and the first move away from G major we get is that A flat, right? But the harmony works in such a way as it sets up this modulation to a new key center of basically A major or stroke A Lydian. So all of that is quite technical, but the melody kind of basically sits around G major until we get up to that point. Now, as Kenny Wheeler is generally taught, we would think of him as being a composer that's appropriate to play chord scales on. So, for instance, first section would be we could play G Lydian over both chords, and then we might sort of think about an F Lydian sound here. So it's kind of, and then F sharp half diminished. Maybe we'd use depending how we felt, I suppose. I think certainly either a melodic minor, A melodic minor, or A Dorian over this bit. I think low grit natural 2 is generally the main suggestion, and then maybe we treat that as an C Lydian, sorry. So that comes A sort of Dorian again. And then actually, oh neat, we got an A flat 7 here, so we can use A melodic minor. So we're kind of sticking around a lot around the minor. It's actually quite easy to play through those changes. However, the only thing is when I play them as voicings, and I'm going to sing the melody along with it, just so to remind you how the melody sounds. Ooh! That D sounds horrible to me. Oof, nasty. But that is a correct voicing if we think about the altered scale. Okay? But, listening back to the record, I realised that none of the soloists use that note. And the reason why I don't use that note is it's actually, that chord is setting up the key of D minor stroke A. And it just sounds a bit out of the key. It's like you're playing like a real kind of strong, pungent dissonance in that new key. And it just doesn't really suit the mood of the song, which is actually quite folky. It's quite open and quite simple. So, actually what you end up playing is you end up just ignoring, you just end up sort of ignoring that altered scale. And instead of playing the A melodic minor at the top of it, you kind of play in D minor. Maybe put the third of the A flat 7 chord, which is C, in there, so you go. Then you've got C major. That sounds so much nicer. If I use the actual melody notes on top, suggest a sort of A7 sharp 9 sound. And that seems to work so much better. And it's like sensitivity to what's going on musically. Now, theoretically, what I was playing was correct in terms of the chord scales, but it just didn't sound right. Now, you can probably think of a broader sense or a deeper sense of theory where you might say, well, actually, it's setting up that D minor mode, so it's not quite right to play A flat altered there. I mean, if we're playing into the A Lydian mode, there's no real reason why we couldn't just use this resolution with a flat 5 going to the E flat minor 9th, and that's fine, but it sounds too complex for the mood of the song. So I think this kind of sounds better. That sounds more in the spirit of the music. I don't know. Another good example would be, all blues, where you get these, probably a more familiar example to most people. There you go, G Dorian. And then we get this. So, I mean, in the textbooks and chord scale textbooks, we would expect to play D altered. takes us out of the key too much. In fact, what you get actually something simpler. It depends from soloist to soloist, but for instance, we could play the G blues scale. That sounds better, but the one I like the best, I think, is if I play over the top of the D7 sharp 9, I actually play a D minor, and then over the top of the E flat 7, I play an E flat minor. And this is interesting because we're thinking of superimposing the tonalities now, so we're actually playing minor over major, which is a very bluesy thing to do. I could play the pentatonic even. Now that sounds better, right? I've actually done another video of this years ago, but and we go much better than the altered scale, which is this. That just sounds complicated and convoluted, but the mood of this song is, again, like Kind Folk, open and simple. Oh, sorry, that's wrong. There's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, theoretically, I think it sounds good in that tune not to have so much going on with the kind of, the leading note of this key, so the third of the dominant chord and that kind of stuff. But I think it's interesting, like we've avoided a lot of these kind of clashy choices, like for instance playing a minor scale over a dominant scale, because really we've become interested as Barry Nettles and the other person, Graf, can't remember the first name, but they wrote in the chord scale book, the Berkeley chord scale book, that chords and scales become two sides of the same coin rather than something separate. But the thing is like in the history of jazz, and this is modal jazz, by the way, which chord scale theory, that's meant to be its area. Really, people don't always use those choices because they kind of sound wrong, and often the right thing to do, especially when you consider a melody like Kind Folk is actually based around a diatonic scale descending that just happens to be harmonized with a dominant scale, dominant chord rather. You get that in Blue Bossa as well, right? I say in situation that flat 9 actually comes from playing minor over that sound, right? It just sounds simpler and better. So I suppose the upshot of this is, I can talk theory all day about, how this does this, or, this is a superposition or whatever, but really when it comes right down to it, you just got to use your ears, and we've got to trust ourselves to be musicians. And I think that's true of all levels. In the original setting, these ideas, chord scale theory and all the rest of it, these were just suggestions, and we're perhaps a little bit guilty of taking them too far and taking them too seriously. Anyway, let me know what you think below. Thanks for watching. Hope that's interesting and thought-provoking for you. Thanks.